So last week we talked about democratic socialism versus social democracy, and I talked to you about how, especially since Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's win in New York, there has been sort of more and more confusion as to what is democratic socialism versus what is social democracy. And I did a story explaining the difference. Democratic socialism is actually socialism, wants to remove capitalism and replace it with socialized ownership of the means of production, at least originally, although now there are people who say, well, they're still democratic socialists, but they don't actually want that, which makes me question whether they're actually democratic socialists at this point. And then on the other hand, we talked about social democracy, which is a progressive movement that wants to work within a market economy, within capitalism, and make it more of what I call a socially guided market economy. And the difference is massive, and the confusion between these two systems is very, very problematic. And the top response that I got from people in the audience was, I mean, of course, other than trolling, was, what's your position, David? And I've mentioned before that I'm not a socialist. I'm a social democrat in the sort of Nordic or Swedish tradition. And today I'm going to explain to you why I am not a socialist. And I'm happy to do this. It's something that's been an area of study for me since undergraduate and even including in graduate school. And I'm going to start sort of at the end, and then we'll walk through it. Fundamentally, I'm not a socialist because I want an egalitarian, free, self-determining society. And that type of society will not emerge from authoritarian apparatus. And what that means is that at the national level, socialist and communist structures are fundamentally authoritarian. And at scale, enacting socialism or communism becomes authoritarian. And a top example is Venezuela. Let's assume in good faith that the Chavez-Maduro goal was a truly egalitarian, free, thriving society. I don't know if it was, but let's be charitable, right? And they really did want that as the end goal. When you put aside the populist, collectivist rhetoric of that regime, the Venezuelan regime is an authoritarian imposition of government without all sorts of freedoms, lacking in press freedom, lacking in judicial freedom. It's a long list, and I'm opposed to it. And whatever their intentions were, their imposition of those intentions in this authoritarian way has led to absolute disaster. And some socialists, Leninists, will say that the opposition to the Venezuelan regime is American AstroTurf, or that the replacement to Maduro might be worse. Step back for a second. An authoritarian apparatus will not lead to an egalitarian, self-determining society, period. But before we get to all of the conclusions, we need to talk about what we mean when we say socialism or communism. When did it start? What does it actually mean? So for our conversation today, when I talk about socialism, I'm talking about modern socialism and communism in the tradition of the 19th century. And if you go back to our Socialism Has Never Worked debunked video, we mentioned older societies and sort of collectivist iterations of economic arrangements. But for today, we're talking about modern socialist theory, and that dates back roughly to about the 1800s. And there are three main lines of socialist theory. Almost no one who likes to talk about socialism on the internet actually knows about this stuff. This is really important. This is the nuts and bolts. First, you had the utopians in the 19th century. These are people like Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. And their idea was that there would be the development of these collectivist, egalitarian, sort of perfect, as the name utopian implies, societies, sometimes in isolated enclaves, and they would eventually spread. And I actually do believe that individually they can work, but once you say this is the system for the country, it becomes authoritarian in its implementation. You'll develop conflicts between these utopian enclaves, but as usual, there was some good stuff proposed there, okay? Their theory applied to an individual company or a commune or a village. It's actually a pretty good idea. I've just not seen evidence that utopian theory can apply to a country of 300 million, for example, but I'm willing to have my mind changed. After the utopians came the anarchists, the sort of second wave, second line of socialists. And the main thing with the anarchists was that government is the problem. They were actually a lot like the more extreme libertarians of today for different reasons than libertarianism. The anarchist socialists saw the government mostly as an apparatus that reinforces the status quo of class divisions, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, or today we could say corporate versus individual interests, or elites versus everybody else. And libertarians, of course, oppose government for different reasons, but there was actually a similarity there. And that also doesn't appeal to me. As most people know, I'm against this on principle. I think that the government does have a role to play. But that being said, the anarchists had some valid critiques. Governments often do become pillars of support for corporate rule. They do reinforce the status quo. They do reinforce power structures. I've seen no evidence that eliminating the government is the solution in the way that the anarcho-socialists or the libertarians believed. Super interesting that even though now libertarians and socialists are mostly diametrically opposed, some of the original strains of socialist thought had a lot in common with libertarianism. They agree. They don't want central government because it's oppressive and tyrannical, but for different reasons. And then after the utopians and after the anarchists, you get to what are now the most common versions of socialism. After utopianism and anarchism came Marxist-Leninism, if we consider it together, or Marxism and then Leninism. They're not actually the same thing. And there, once again, there is stuff of value. If people could realize that many of the critiques made by socialism are actually really good, we'd be much better off. Some of the solutions they propose have only elements of good ideas, and in Marxism, it's the labor theory of value. Extraordinarily brilliant analysis of how capitalism works, which basically pointed out that you have fixed costs, like if you're going to make a product, if you're going to make computers, for example, you've got your fixed material costs, you've got the factory, you need to buy the semiconductors, all of that stuff. And then you bring in workers and you pay them something with the idea that they add more than that to the total value, and that's surplus value. You might have in a $100 computer, $50 of parts, and then $50 of added value. If you can pay the worker $30 to add $50 of value, you've created $20 of surplus value. This is a great analysis. This is an absolutely accurate analysis. The problem is I don't believe the ultimate solution to that identification is the end stage of capitalism with a Marxist revolution. That's not what I see as the long-term solution. So again, utopianism. I don't think it would work at the country level, but for individual companies or communes, I think it's actually a great idea to organize co-ops and shared ownership. Great. That has worked. We can apply it to healthcare. We can apply it to education. I don't see that as the solution to all of society. Anarchism, skeptical of government. Government has become a tool of the elites in many ways. We see it in the United States with Democrats and Republicans using government as a way to maintain the status quo. It's a good critique. I disagree that eliminating government is the solution. And so what previously had been sort of a cohesive movement, but with different approaches, utopianism, anarchism, Marxism, Leninism, eventually what we saw around the time of Lenin was a split between actual socialists and those who went in the direction of social democracy. And I believe that there are a number of reasons why social democracy is the way forward and socialism is not. And in explaining this to you, you'll identify many right-wing arguments against socialism, which I actually don't think are good ones. And this gets to one of my fundamental oppositions to socialism's view of the distributions of outcomes versus social democracies. Socialism in the Marxist, Leninist sort of tradition is simply not aligned with the realities of human distribution, because when we look at human endeavors, they have unequal distribution. If you look at athletic ability and how it's distributed, if you look at linguistic proficiency, if you look at business success, if you look at human height, human weight, it's all distributed on a curve. And on the one hand, where socialism wants to level out the distribution in a way that I've not seen evidence can actually be achieved without significant downsides, what social democracy wants to do is tweak that distribution, lower the absolute top, raise the bottom a little bit, and then reduce the gap between the very bottom and the very top. You're sort of leveling it out. You're raising the mean and reducing the difference between top and bottom. I think it's important to look at Sweden as an example. The right hates looking at Sweden. Sweden's Social Democratic Party, which I identify with, was built on 5 principles that will sound really familiar to social democrats, to people who follow Bernie Sanders. And those 5 principles were, number 1, an integrative democracy. That means, and we can leave this up, that means that democratic decision-making is the standard for legitimacy, period. Real democracy. The people decide the direction. Number 2, the concept of the people's home, meaning solidarity and equality of treatment as something that everybody is committed to. There's no debate, right? You need that. Number 3, socioeconomic equality and economic efficiency are complementary. These are often considered opposing forces by the capitalists, right? The vulture capitalists, which is you can either have an economically efficient society or one that is more equal. The social democratic tradition actually sees those as complementary. Number 4, you have a socially controlled market economy. And this is huge. It's still a market economy. It's still capitalism. But the economy's direction and the priorities are determined socially. Doesn't mean society owns the means of production, as in socialism, but society guides the market economy. And 5th, proper expansion of the public sector expands freedom and freedom of choice. Think about it. Healthcare for all lets people get the jobs that are actually their passion. Socialized education means that people can really study what they want rather than deciding on the cheapest career to avoid student loans. This is all in line with my ideology, but it still exists within a capitalist market economy that allows for entrepreneurship and individualization and all of the good things that come from the natural diversity of people. Now, when you talk about Sweden and you talk to the right, they will try to destroy these talking points, and you've got to know how they try to do it. A popular one is, okay, that worked in Sweden because Sweden is homogenous. It's all white. It wouldn't work in a diverse country. This is patently absurd, okay? The US is 77% white. Sweden is 85% white, okay? The idea that those 8 percentage points are what make a system work in Sweden and not in the US is absolutely laughable. It's also funny, the hypocrisy that many right-wingers simultaneously claim Sweden is being taken over by brown immigrants and it's chaos, but at the same time, Sweden works really well because everybody is white. That should make everybody say, wait a second, that doesn't really make sense. Consider the counterpoint. If the United States were all white, would the Swedish model work? It's absurd. The United States is huge, and with such differences in education and religion and so many other things, just making the US all white would not be what either makes or doesn't make the Swedish system work. Now, here's where the critique actually defends social democracy over socialism. A totally socialist society, whether Marxist or utopian or anarchist or Leninist in the US, would actually be impossible. But what wouldn't be impossible would be socializing certain elements of American society. Healthcare, for example. Very doable. Large countries socialize healthcare. Education. Education could be put into sort of the umbrella of social welfare in the United States. That's the social democratic model that I support. One other argument from the right, which is they say it works in Sweden because Sweden is small and the US is big. That's part of why I believe that total socialism actually is not the path forward, but that there are socializable components which would work absolutely fine in the United States. So to sort of give you the highlights of why I'm not a socialist and I am a social democrat, I believe that a socially directed market economy that reduces income inequality and ensures a real standard of living for everybody is more realistic, and it's also more in line with human nature, which it actually shows that there is distribution when it comes to any endeavor that humans get involved in. And I fundamentally, and this gets back to the real reason that I so vehemently oppose what we see going on in Venezuela and what we see and have seen in other places around the world, I do not believe, because I've seen no evidence, that an egalitarian, self-determining, free society will develop from an authoritarian apparatus, period. I'm willing to change my mind, so let me know your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And I look forward to dialogue on this issue going forward. I'm really thrilled to tell you that today's program is made possible in part by betterhelp.com/Pakman. As many of you know, I have been working very hard on this program to reduce stigma around mental health, to reduce stigma around seeking help. And I have a family that is very involved in mental health. And if you've not already heard about BetterHelp, it is a tremendous resource. BetterHelp gives you, through your phone and computer, affordable private access to licensed, trained, accredited, experienced psychologists, counselors, therapists, and clinical social workers who are dedicated to helping you through whatever is going on in your life. You just go to betterhelp.com/Pakman, fill out a questionnaire. They will match you with a counselor that will work best for you. They are LGBT friendly. You can even say, I want a counselor who's not religious, if that's important to you. If your initial match isn't a good vibe, you can switch to a different counselor. And the beauty is that not only do you get unlimited counseling over video, phone, and text from at home and on the go, it is way cheaper than in-person counseling. And after 3 months, it becomes even cheaper for you. They also have financial aid for people who need help paying, but you get the same professional licensed therapy that you would by going to someone's office. And I believe that so many people would benefit from therapy, whether you're dealing with an acute situation in your life, whether there are bigger picture difficulties that you're experiencing. Please consider checking out betterhelp.com/Pakman. It's easy to sign up and get started. We've put a link in the description if you're watching on YouTube. Once again, that is betterhelp.com/PAKMAN.